Hi, Imrila. And on the morning of my sister's wedding, I got a text that simply said, "Don't come, just send a gift." No explanation, no apology, just erasure clean and silent. I paid for the venue, the flowers, the damn photographer. But my name? Nowhere. Not in the program, not in the photos, not in the speeches. And when I finally drew a line, they called me bitter. But what if the truth was, I'd been erased long before the wedding ever happened? What happens when the people who raised you turn your loyalty into a currency? And what do you do when love feels more like a transaction? Let me tell you. The coffee pot hissed softly behind me, its gurgle oddly soothing in an otherwise still morning. I stood by the window, the gray Seattle sky blanketing the Queen Anne neighborhood like a damp wool coat. It wasn't raining yet, but it would. It always did. I wrapped my hands around my mug and glanced at my phone, expecting maybe a weather alert or some early client message. Instead, the screen glared back with 5 simple words. "Don't come, just send a gift." My thumb hovered over the screen, motionless. I read it once. Again. The words didn't change. I looked at the sender, Celine, my sister, the one getting married today. A heat crept up my chest, curling behind my ears. My fingers squeezed the ceramic until I remembered to breathe. I sat down slowly at the kitchen table, trying not to let my hands shake. This wasn't a prank. Celine was never the prank type. No sorry, no it's complicated. Just, don't come. Just send a gift. I started to type a reply, then stopped. What was there to say that she hadn't just said louder by omission? Months ago, she cried on my couch when they couldn't afford the venue deposit. Victor had lost another job. Vera had too much going on. ID pulled out my card without hesitation, told her it was handled. I even booked the photographer she said she always dreamed of. And now, I wasn't even invited. I opened my email, searching for the invitation link she once mentioned. Nothing. No Ryla plus guest, not even a mass send. I checked the wedding website. No login matched my email. I went to Celine's Instagram. Stories from the rehearsal dinner danced across the screen. Champagne flutes, sparklers, fake laughter. I wasn't tagged in any of them, not a single one. And that stung in a way I didn't know pixels could. Scrolling back, I spotted a photo of the bachelorette weekend in Napa. Everyone in matching silk robes. Everyone but me. I clicked the photographer's teaser post today's sneak peeks. There she was. My sister, beaming in her custom gown. Vera standing tall beside her, one hand resting on Victor's shoulder, like she had raised him too. Our cousins, family friends, old neighbors. All smiling, all present. Caption. Surrounded by the ones who've always been there. I blinked, stared, blinked again. My breath caught somewhere behind my collarbone. I paid for this shoot. That camera angle, that lighting. I almost commented. Almost. Instead, I locked my phone and set it down with too much force. It wasn't just about the wedding. It wasn't just one morning. This had been building, quietly. 1,000 little erasures. Not being asked to speak at Celine's engagement party, being left out of Mother's Day plans because it was a last-minute brunch, watching Vera repost everyone's graduation but mine. I had made peace with silence. But today it tasted like betrayal. I opened my bottom desk drawer, pulled out an old leather-bound notebook I hadn't touched in years. Inside, scribbled notes from college loan payments I'd co-signed for Celine. Grocery receipts from the months after she'd moved in with me, even the florist invoice nearly $200. I flipped to a clean page and wrote across the top, what I gave versus what they remembered. And then I started listing, not because I wanted payback, but because, for the first time, I needed to remember. Because they clearly didn't. She chose to write instead of scream, and that's when the storm really began. The handwriting trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of things unsaid for far too long. The past doesn't leave quietly. It resurfaces in numbers, in memories, and in silence, that was never really silence. I folded the last receipt into the folder and slid it into my tote bag. The air in my apartment had gone still, the kind of stillness that sinks into your skin and settles in your chest. I didn't want a fight. I just wanted a reason. The drive to Vera's house didn't feel long, but the rain made every street feel like it was part of a movie set I didn't want to be in. The windshield wipers kept time with my thoughts, and every red light gave me a moment to wonder if I should turn around. But I didn't. I kept going. Her porch light was on, as always. Vera opened the door in slippers and a pale cardigan. No look of surprise, no tension in her brow. Just, "Oh, hey, honey," like we hadn't just crossed some invisible fault line the size of the Cascades. I stood in the foyer, dripping water onto the doormat, holding my breath for a beat too long. "I got a text from Celine," I started, my voice low. Her eyes didn't shift. "Mm-hmm." "She told me not to come. To the wedding." A pause. "Well," she said, adjusting her sleeve like it had betrayed her. "It's their day. Sometimes it's better to avoid tension." "Tension. You're just too much sometimes," she added. Not cruelly, just casually. "People get uncomfortable." The words landed flat, like a slap with the back of a spoonlight, but loud in its message. "I paid for that wedding," I said, more to myself than to her. "I know," she said simply, then turned back toward the kitchen, as if that ended the conversation. But it didn't end anything. I didn't follow. I sat down on the edge of the couch I practically grew up on, my fingers tracing the stitching on the throw pillow she'd probably had since I was in high school. The silence thickened. It wasn't confusion on her part. It was consent. Passive, quiet, dangerous consent. Years ago, Thanksgiving I'd hosted, because no one else had the space. I paid for the meal, the decor, even the staff who cleaned up after everyone left. Celine brought 2 bottles of wine and walked away with all the praise. "She's so organized," they had said. "A real woman of grace." Vera had nodded, smiling, as if Celine had roasted the turkey herself. I didn't bring that up now. I didn't need to. The drive home felt different. Wetter, somehow. I didn't play music, just let the rain narrate. I made a mental list. It wasn't hard, my memory doesn't fail me. When it comes to debt that isn't mine. I thought of the hospital bill I covered when Celine had Lily and Victor vanished for 3 weeks. The down payment for the Prius she couldn't get approved for alone. The spiritual retreat in Sedona Vera begged to attend after Dad passed, claiming she needed closure. I booked it. I didn't go. I stayed home and managed the bills. I had never asked for praise. But being erased? That was a different kind of insult. It wasn't just this wedding. This had been going on for years. A quiet removal of presence, done so smoothly it took until now for me to feel the outline of the hole they'd carved. I didn't cry. Not because it didn't hurt, but because I'd already cried about the smaller things. This required something else. Back at home, I pulled up my bank's dashboard. I printed every statement connected to them shared payments, co-signed cards, gift transfers. Each sheet landed on the table like a fingerprint. Then I grabbed a fresh folder and labeled it in thick black marker. Everything they forgot, this wasn't spite. It was archiving. This was not revenge. It was remembrance. No more wondering if I was imagining it. No more hoping that maybe they just forgot to include me. I wasn't going to scream, but I was done whispering. The handwriting trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of things unsaid for far too long. The past doesn't leave quietly. It resurfaces in numbers, in memories, and in silence that was never really silence. And some truths are like splinters. They fester until you pull them out. By the time I got home, the drizzle had thickened to something more committed. I dropped my keys on the counter, kicked off my shoes, and sat down at the kitchen table without bothering to turn on the lights. The soft hum of the refrigerator was the only thing that acknowledged me. I reached for the folder I'd labeled the night before, everything they forgot, but my hand paused on something else. Another file, older, thicker, and buried behind an old takeout menu. Its label read, "Personal Don't Forget Again." Inside, tucked behind tax returns and medical receipts, was a yellowed envelope. My name, written in block letters, was scrawled across the front. It was the acceptance letter from the University of Oregon. I hadn't seen it in years. I unfolded it slowly. The words were crisp, the ink still bold. I could hear myself, 17 years old, screaming when I opened it. I'd gotten in. I had a plan, a future. Until Vera sat me down 2 weeks later at the kitchen table, the same one I now sat at, and said, "Your sister's in trouble. They're falling behind on rent." He left again. "She needs help, and you'll have more chances later." She doesn't. I remember nodding. I remember the guilt. And then the savings account had built from tutoring and babysitting and selling secondhand textbooks gone. The college plan dissolved in a matter of days. Celine stayed afloat. I never enrolled. Looking at the letter now, I didn't feel regret. I felt used. For years, I convinced myself it was a choice, that I'd done something noble. But it wasn't a choice. It was an ask I wasn't allowed to refuse. I slid the envelope back in and leaned over the kitchen counter to steady myself. On the fridge was an old magnet I had made in elementary school plastic, cracked, barely clinging to the door. World's best mom. Funny how things age out of truth. I remembered another moment, a barbecue years later, Vera pouring sweet tea for her cousins. One of them had asked how Celine managed everything so well, balancing Lily, a flaky husband, and her events business. Vera had smiled and said, "Well, Ryla's great with money, but Celine's got the heart." That line carved a trench deeper than they knew. I wasn't generous, I was just great with money, and somehow that made me less human, less deserving, less seen. It stuck. I heard it again from a family friend. "Ryla? Oh, she's sharp. Not the warmest, though." I hadn't even realized I'd started believing it. That maybe I was just the reliable one. The one who doesn't need the hug. The one who doesn't get invited because she's too logical to care. But I did care. I always had. I just stopped showing it when it stopped mattering. I opened my laptop and created a new document. At the top, I typed, "They said what I did." On the left column, I wrote, "Shah's too intense. She doesn't understand family. She's good with money, not with people." And next to each, I filled in the receipts. Paid for wedding deposit, covered rent for Celine twice, co-signed for Vera's SUV lease, paid off Lily's ER bill after a bike accident. I kept going until the left column felt like a script written for someone I didn't recognize, and the right side looked like a resume I never submitted. These weren't acts of generosity anymore. They were obligations spun from emotional debt. I scrolled through the spreadsheet, noticing a pattern I hadn't wanted to see before. Every time I had money, they had a need. Every time I had peace, they had a crisis. The light over the stove buzzed slightly as I got up to grab a pen. I highlighted a few lines for $800 florist invoice, $2,000 venue deposit, $325 dress alteration fee. Every transaction a brick in the foundation of their joy. My erasure had been built with funds I provided. I didn't want an apology anymore. I wanted acknowledgement. But even that felt like asking too much. I clicked save and closed the laptop. The folder snapped shut with a quiet click. Then I pulled it off the desk and placed it in a locked drawer. I wasn't going to burn the records. I was going to remember. Seeing isn't enough, though. Eventually, you have to decide what to do with the truth. The next morning, the lies didn't look any different, but my response to them would. The first voicemail was my mother's. It sounded sweet until she said I'd embarrassed the family. I hadn't even made it through my first sip of coffee when the alert popped up. Shared card ending in 3287 has exceeded spending limit. My shoulders tensed, my stomach clenched. I hadn't used that card in months since I'd realized they'd quietly left my name attached to all the financial backbones of Celine's wedding. I logged in. Bridal alterations, catering balance, late floral deposits, and a charge for a private shuttle service labeled guest pickup. The total amount sat blinking at me like an open dare. I didn't hesitate. I hovered my cursor over the option for one long second, then clicked. Freeze card. There was no ceremony to it, no dramatic music, no confetti or applause, just a quiet confirmation message and a stillness that spread over me like clarity. 10 minutes later, my phone lit up. First Vera. "Why would you do this on Celine's big weekend?" she asked without even a hello. "Do you have any idea how that looks to our family?" "Our family?" I repeated. "You mean the one I wasn't invited to celebrate with?" She scoffed. "Don't be dramatic. You know how Celine is. It's not always about you." Then came Celine's message, short and sharp like a blade under the ribs. "You're just bitter you weren't invited." Pathetic. Neither of them apologized. They didn't ask what was wrong. They didn't question why I'd done it. They just demanded that I undo it. I didn't answer. I sat still, phone screen glowing like a wound on my desk. For years, it equated kindness with silence. That by staying quiet, by giving without asking, I was keeping peace. But this wasn't peace. This was exploitation wrapped in good manners. I remembered the Christmas 3 years ago. Celine had missed 2 rent payments, and I covered them without question. She didn't even thank me. She handed out gift cards to Vera and Victor's parents at dinner and said, "This year's been tough, but I've been so blessed by people who really show up." I sat right there at the same table. And I said nothing. I smiled and sipped my wine and told myself I was being mature. But freezing that card? That was the first time I'd said no without explanation. And they hated it. The voicemail that followed was Celine's. Her voice was lower than usual, cold and measured. "You're nothing without your money. That's all you are to this family. Just the one who pays so no one has to talk to you." I replayed that part 3 times, not because I couldn't believe it, but because it rang so familiar, so rehearsed. As if it had been said before, behind my back. Maybe even at that wedding I'd funded but never attended. I saved the file to a folder labeled "Proof Not Paranoia." I didn't scream. I didn't send a reply. I just sat with it. That voice note was more valuable than any apology. That afternoon, I opened my email and saw a message from a legal firm I'd bookmarked months ago but never contacted. The subject line read, "Still interested in an asset liability review?" Maybe I was. I clicked it open. There was a name, a direct line, a contact form. I filled it out without fanfare. I wasn't looking to soigner yet, but I needed to know what was legally mine, what names I was attached to, what accounts could still be used under my signature without my knowledge. Because now I understood. They weren't going to stop, not unless I made it impossible for them to keep using me. That night, I microwaved a frozen dinner and watched the rain blur the windows. The house was quiet. Not lonely, just quiet. I could breathe in it. I thought about every conversation where I'd chosen not to speak. Every moment I minimized my discomfort so they wouldn't feel embarrassed. Every check I wrote that I called help, but they treated as their right. Cutting the card wasn't revenge. It was a beginning. The silence after I froze the card didn't last. Neither did the illusion that they'd ever respected me. The next call didn't come from family. It came from the florist, asking who would settle the overdue invoice. The invitation wasn't for me, but my name was written all over the bill. I was wrapping up a report for the foundation when the fraud alert came through. A co-signed loan had been activated, a wedding expense loan. I hadn't signed for anything. I hadn't authorized anything. My name shouldn't have been involved. But there it was, flagged under joint authorization, approved by someone who didn't even bother to tell me. I opened my email, my hands already trembling, not with fear, but with the familiar taste of disbelief. I searched for any document trail, buried deep in a thread from Varen old email, with the subject "Quick favor, just click," and confirm was a PDF attachment. I opened it. It was a copy of a financial authorization form, and at the bottom, my name, my signature. Except it wasn't mine. They'd scanned a signature from an unrelated document, A reimbursement form from last year's scholarship audit. Vera had taken that file, copied the signature, and pasted it onto this loan authorization. Not a mistake, not a misunderstanding, a deliberate digital betrayal. I printed it and slid the sheet into my growing folder. Proof, not paranoia. I didn't call. I didn't email. I got into my car and drove. The roads were still damp from a morning drizzle, and by the time I pulled up outside Vera's house, I'd already rehearsed the conversation 50 different ways. None of them ended well. She opened the door wearing the same robe she always wore when she wanted to seem fragile. I didn't wait for an invitation. I stepped inside, held up the printed page. "You want to explain this?" She glanced at it, barely flinching. "That again?" "It's not a big deal. You've always helped us before." "This isn't helping," I said, voice steady. "It's theft." "Oh, please." She turned toward the kitchen like it asked her to pass the salt. "You've always had more. You were going to cover it anyway. We just skipped the asking this time." I froze in the doorway, the casual cruelty of it. How easily she said "we's" if this had been some agreed-upon arrangement. "So you just decided it was okay to use me?" She set the kettle on the stove, her back to me. "You never say no, Ryla. That's the thing about you. You always come through." It wasn't flattery, it was indictment. I had trained them for this. Every check I wrote, every time I told myself I was keeping peace, I had been teaching them how to ignore my boundaries. I sat down at the breakfast bar and looked at her. Really looked. And for the first time, I didn't see a mother. I saw a strategist, one who'd used guilt and silence and obligation like tools. "You've always made us feel small," she said suddenly, almost too softly. "With your tone, your corrections, your competence. It's easier when you're not around." There it was. The confession. Not that I was wrong, but that I was inconvenient. It wasn't that I didn't belong, it was that I didn't shrink enough to make them feel big. I folded the paper back into my purse. My voice didn't rise. I didn't shake. "If you ever use my name again on anything, I'll make sure you deal with more than just the bank. Do you understand me?" She blinked. But she didn't speak. "I'm not asking for respect anymore. I'm demanding distance." I stood up, walked out without looking back. The sound of the screen door slamming behind me felt like punctuation. The air outside smelled like moss and firewood, familiar and clean. For once, I wasn't the one explaining, justifying, absorbing. I was the one drawing the line, and this time, I wasn't crossing it again. I expected silence after I left. What I got instead was a celebration I never agreed to fund. They sent out thank you cards that week, embossed in gold. Mine never arrived, but the invoice did. The last time they used my name without asking, I cleaned up the mess. This time, documenting everything. I was sitting at my desk that morning when the notification popped up. A friend had tagged me in a post. I didn't think twice until I saw what it was. The wedding video. I paused with my fingers still hovering over the keyboard. My thumb hovered above the play button for longer than I care to admit. Then I tapped it. Soft music played over a slow-motion shot of Celine walking down the aisle, eyes wide like she was the protagonist in a romantic comedy. The video swept through flower arrangements, table settings, guests dabbing their eyes in slow pans. Every name was dropped Vera, Aunt Linda, the planner Celine found last minute. Even Victor's old college roommate got a mention for always being a rock. My name didn't come up, not once. And yet I recognized the signature of every vendor. The lighting design ID approved it. The photographer, they were on my payroll. The string quartet? ID written the check directly. It wasn't just that I wasn't invited. I had been scrubbed out of the record. Erased. The final clip showed Quentin standing up at the mic, one arm around Celine, the other holding a glass of something expensive. "We couldn't have done this without our support system," he said, voice shaky in that carefully rehearsed way. "To everyone who gave their time, their love, and their energy, we thank you. You are why we made it here. The camera swept across a crowd of nodding heads. Vera dabbed at her eyes like someone had died. I stared at the screen, not angry, not surprised. There was no heartbreak in being excluded this time, just confirmation of what I already knew. I closed the browser, then reopened a different Tab Me Nonprofits backend dashboard. I hadn't planned on checking it, but something nudged me. That's when I saw it. A flagged transaction. Transferred to Dalloway Events. Amount $7,600. Description: Venue Coordination Youth Empowerment Gala. Except there hadn't been a Youth Empowerment Gala, at least not one had signed off on. I pulled the original disbursement request. It had Celini's name attached as community partner. The event listed had no recorded attendance, no marketing materials, no vendor receipts, just one big transfer. And it had come out of our scholarship reserve. The air in the room felt thinner. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the screen until the numbers blurred. Celine had taken the money meant for students, and routed it through my nonprofit to pay for her damn wedding. And she did it using my name. I picked up the phone and called Rachel, my compliance officer. I kept my voice measured. We've got a transaction I need flagged and locked down. Start an internal audit. Effective immediately. She didn't ask questions, she never did. Just said, got it, and started moving. I printed every document, highlighted every discrepancy. I opened another folder. This one I labeled Misuse Immediate Action. Later that day, I reviewed my nonprofit's public web pages and quietly removed Celini's listing from the Community Partners section. I deleted her testimonial quote. I changed the donor recognition language to reflect verified contributors only. Then, I changed every single account password. This wasn't revenge. It was preservation. That evening, Vera called. I let it go to voicemail. She left a message that started with, I don't know what Celini told you, and ended with, you're making this harder than it needs to be. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. By morning, I'd prepared a memo for the board. No names, just facts. Misuse of allocated funds, redirected through unauthorized events. An internal review had been launched. All disbursements paused until the issue was resolved. My phone buzzed around lunchtime. This time, it was from the event planner, confused, frantic. Ryla, there's been some sort of mix-up. The check we received was canceled? Celine's saying you're pulling support for the event retroactively? I responded with one sentence. There was no authorized event. Then I hung up. Because it wasn't my job to keep cleaning up after people who pretend I don't exist until they need my name on the check. The clip faded to black, but I was still watching no longer for memories, but for evidence. The apology never came, but the excuses showed up right on schedule. The next invoice they received wasn't for money. It was for consequences. It was nearly 10 p.m. when Vera's voice crackled through my voicemail, soft and syrupy, like she was holding a cup of tea and pretending everything was fine. She started with pleasantries. I've been thinking about youthin slipped in the real reason. If you could just cover the electric bill this month, I'd really appreciate it. Just until we get through this tight patch? There it was. Not an apology, not acknowledgement, just a pitch dressed as love. I replayed the message once, then again. It felt rehearsed. The kind of sweetness people use when they want to sell you something you didn't ask for. I didn't call her back. 10 minutes later, a text from Celine lit up the screen. It's not too late to fix this. Just don't make it worse than it has to be. No subject, no name, no warmth. I replied with a single period. Then I blocked both numbers. I thought I was prepared for anything after that. I was wrong. The next day, a colleague forwarded a screenshot from a printed wedding programme they'd picked up while attending the ceremony on behalf of another donor. At the bottom of the page, under contributors, was my name, misspelled. Listed beneath event support family sponsor. I stared at it for a full minute. There was no typo. That was deliberate. They wanted the benefit of my name, just not the truth of it. They'd reduced me to a line item, a label, not a sister, not a daughter, not a person, a checkbook. I forwarded the image to my attorney, Leland, with no explanation. I didn't need one. 2 hours later, I sat across from him in his office, the window behind him catching the last amber streaks of sunset over Seattle. He didn't waste time. "You have a case," he said plainly. "Defamation is arguable, but reputational damage through misrepresentation tied to financial records? Very arguable." I didn't flinch. "But the bigger question," he continued, "is what you want to do." "I want it to stop," I said. "I want them to stop using my name like a credit card with no limit." He nodded. "Then we send a cease and desist. We begin the process of separating your identity, legally, professionally, publicly. It won't be loud, but it will be clear, clear. That's all I wanted." The next morning, I sat at my desk and opened the nonprofit's website. I removed every mention of Vera and Celine from our public-facing partnerships, deleted their bios, stripped the galas page of the glowing quote Celine had once offered ironically about integrity in community leadership. Then I posted a brief statement on our homepage. In light of recent internal reviews, the Foundation has updated its public affiliations and funding channels to reflect verified transparency and stewardship. We remain committed to serving our mission with accountability and respect. No names, no accusations, just truth, dressed in facts. That evening, my inbox stayed quiet. No texts, no voicemails. For once, the silence wasn't dismissive. It was defensive. They knew. And the silence was louder than any apology I never got. They misnamed me to diminish me. But I still had one name left. They hadn't erased my own. The flowers they bought with my name wilted. But my signature? That was still intact. Saturday morning, the market stalls along Ballard Avenue were alive with that usual rhythm: dogs sniffing at bakery bags, kids dragging tired parents past flower carts, vendors bantering over crates of produce. It only meant to stop for a basket of tomatoes. But someone tapped my shoulder just as I reached for my wallet. "Tessa?" She lit up like it handed her a winning lottery ticket. "Ryla! I was hoping I'd bump into you. I saw the wedding video. I just knew you had something to do with it. That set-up classic you." Her hug was tight, familiar. It knocked something loose in me. I laughed gently, but it wasn't amusement I felt. It was that strange sting that comes when someone you haven't seen in years sees you more clearly than your own family ever tried to. Tessa stepped back. "You still working with the Foundation?" "Yeah," I said, "trying to keep the lights on." She smiled and then lowered her voice. "Do you remember sophomore year? You paid for Carla's semester when her dad got laid off. She never forgot that." I blinked. I hadn't thought about that in years. Well, she did. Still does. Said you were the only person who didn't make her feel like a burden. We said our goodbyes, promised coffee that would never happen, and I walked the rest of the market with something different pulsing behind my ribs. Not hurt, not pride, recognition. Not from the people who shared my blood, but from someone who'd simply paid attention. That night, I sat down at my desk and pulled up the paperwork I'd been too tired to finish. But now, I wasn't tired, I was ready. I removed Vera from every emergency contact for medical, business, financial. Then Celine's name came up on the co-signatory line for the Foundation. I revoked it, effective immediately. She no longer had access to anything. I submitted a formal declaration of financial disassociation to both the bank and the state office. A copy was printed and placed in a new file. Final notice internal. There was no announcement, no drama, just a paper trail. For once, I wasn't reacting, I was reclaiming. The next morning, before logging into work, I updated the Foundation's website. Right on the homepage, under a crisp new banner, I added a message. Effective immediately, we have revised our leadership affiliations and funding structure to reflect current values and accountability. No names, just purpose. But the ripple was instant. That afternoon, a donor emailed me. Did something happen with the Dalloway family? Another wrote, "We support whatever decision this reflects. Thank you for your integrity." And then, the call came in from Celine's wedding planner. confused. Hi, we were told you'd processed the final floral payment, but the bank's saying otherwise. I told her the truth. The payment was never approved. The funds were misdirected and have since been reassigned. A pause. So, you're pulling your support? I didn't correct her. I didn't need to. That evening, I locked my apartment door, took off my coat, and stood by the window. The city looked different, not brighter, just clearer. I sipped my tea and listened to nothing. No calls, no threats, no passive-aggressive voicemails. Just stillness. And I finally felt what they tried to make me believe I didn't deserve. Peace. I didn't need them to acknowledge what they took. I needed to reclaim what I gave too freely. The next letter I wrote wasn't addressed to them, it was addressed to myself. I had just handed over a check at the front desk of the Women's Shelter, quarterly donation I'd quietly committed, to when I caught a glimpse of a familiar silhouette near the entrance. A little girl in a soft pink hoodie stood next to a babysitter, gripping a juice box with both hands and looking at me like I was some half-remembered story from a book she wasn't old enough to read. She blinked slowly, eyes narrowing in confusion. Then, clear as a bell, she said, "My mommy says you're not really family. You just send money." The babysitter's mouth dropped open, her cheeks flushing in panic. "Lily, no, sweetie, we don't say." I held up a hand gently. "It's okay." And it was. She didn't mean it cruelly. She was simply parroting what she'd heard at home, what Celine had poured into her like it was fact. Kids don't lie. They just repeat the truths adults hand them like inheritance. I crouched slightly and gave her a small, sad smile. "You know," I said softly, "I used to think the same thing." Lily tilted her head, puzzled but quiet now. Her juice box crinkled softly in her hand. I nodded once to the babysitter, then turned and walked back toward my car. The drive home was silent, but not the hollow kind that once used to make my heart ache. No, this silence had weight, presence. It wasn't loneliness, it was liberation. Lily's words, innocent and blunt, didn't hurt the way they might have a year ago. Instead, they rang like a bell of truth, shaking loose something old and rotten inside me. Celine hadn't just erased me. She was laying the foundation for the next generation to never know I existed. It wasn't enough for her to cut me out. She was passing the scissors to her daughter. But I wasn't going to play tug-of-war anymore. I wasn't going to beg a seat at a table where my only value was transactional. I had spent enough years proving, funding, explaining, appeasing. And for what? A place in a family that traded love for leverage? That evening, I sat alone at my kitchen table, the same worn surface where I once froze the card that funded their cruelty, printed receipts that no one ever acknowledged, and built legal folders full of evidence that went unread. But this time, there were no spreadsheets, no panic, no adrenaline, just paper, ink, my handwriting. I didn't write to be forgiven or understood. I wrote to record what happened. It wasn't a letter, it was a ledger. A clean, complete accounting. The money they siphoned. The properties I revoked access to. The trust accounts I'd rerouted to ethical hands. I attached copies of the legal filings, dates, sign-offs. Everything accurate, unemotional, undeniable. At the bottom of the last page, beneath the final line, I wrote, "This isn't punishment. This is peace. With truth. Ryla." I sealed it in a plain envelope, no embellishments, and dropped it into the outgoing bin in my building's lobby. No return address, no expectation, no more open loops. Back upstairs, I opened my phone. Vera. Blocked. Celine. Blocked. Family group threads. Deleted. Emergency contacts. Updated. The spare house key I'd kept on my ring more out of sentiment than sense, slipped into a small padded envelope and mailed it to Selena's address. It was the last object tying me to a version of the past I no longer lived in. There were no dramatic speeches, no social media essays. I didn't change my number or announce a fresh start. I just stopped replying, stopped explaining, stopped arriving where I was only tolerated. By week's end, my calendar was nearly empty. No forced brunches, no baby showers I was guilted into, no last-minute errands masked as help but rooted in expectation. For the first time in years, my weekends were mine. And that Saturday, I made good on a promise I'd made to myself in the quiet. I walked into the local community college just down the road. Room 214. Nothing fancy. Just me, a whiteboard, a stack of handouts, and 12 folding chairs. I had volunteered to lead a free workshop, Financial Clarity for Women Starting Over. There were no cameras, no newspaper write-ups, just a dozen women, some young, some older, some newly divorced, some just tired, who had walked in carrying questions and walked out carrying tools. I stood at the front of the room with a dry erase marker and a deep breath, and when I opened my mouth to speak, my voice didn't waver. "Hi," I said, looking into their eyes, not down at my notes. "My name is Ryla Keene, and today we're going to talk about protecting what's yours starting with your name. No tears, no applause. But for the first time in as long as I could remember, I felt like I belonged in the room I was standing in, not because of what I gave, but because of who I was. And that was more than enough. There's a kind of peace that doesn't come from getting justice. It comes from walking away with your integrity intact. I didn't win anything flashy. I didn't get a dramatic apology. What I got was better, my own voice back, my name untangled from people who only saw it as a resource. If I could tell my younger self or anyone listening one thing, it would be this. Your boundaries are not a betrayal. You are allowed to outgrow people who only clapped when you were useful and disappeared when you were human. Family isn't just blood. It's behavior. It's how people protect your name when you're not in the room. If they don't, you don't owe them another explanation. Now, I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to walk away from someone who kept crossing the line? Have you been the one who always gave, only to be forgotten when the photos were printed? Drop a 1 in the comments if this story spoke to you, or let me know where you're tuning in from. If you didn't connect with this video, I'd still love to hear why. Honest feedback builds real stories. If you're new here and this story meant something to you, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. We share real stories for real people, because healing begins when truth is told out loud. Thanks for watching. See you in the next story.